welcome to this very special episode of the Dado Center's Operational Art Podcast, coming to you from the Homefront Command in Ramleh, Israel, where we give you a unique insight into the most important discussions in the Israeli national security community today. Whether you're a singer in Singapore, a pork packer in Prague, or a pen seller in Pensacola, wherever you are in this world, we welcome you and we are happy to have you join us on this very special episode. I am Lazer Berman, and I am joined by the sharpest man in national security today, the godfather of my future children. Here he is, Mr. Shmuel. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about the subject of air power. Now, in my reading, so much has been written about air power. Why is it relevant? Why is it so important that we're having this discussion today?
So air power has been one of the most significant developments of the 20th century. And bucket loads of money have been invested in this.
Probably bigger than buckets.
Oh yeah, boatloads. And we need to still discuss whether or not it's worth the money and the resources. So it's interesting, especially in these austere times of no money at all.
I think that's a very important point. We've entered into an age where social programs and military spending have run up against each other. So we're going to tie that all in, and we're going to talk about air power from a historical perspective. We're going to bring it today, and we have the perfect person to talk about that. We have my friend, my colleague, Major Dan Barak, who is the head of the Doctrine and Concepts Development Branch in the Israeli Air Force. Here he is. Dan, welcome.
Hey, guys.
Happy to have you here. Let's get right into the discussion. Let's talk briefly about the historical development of air power. Now, it came about in the First World War. Some say before that, even the Civil War, you had things like balloons. But how would you trace the development of air power? What were the major events in the historical progress of air power?
Well, big wars are always a great example to see what happened in the time in between. If you look at naval warfare or land warfare, it's been here for ages. And air warfare is relatively new. It's a matter of the 20th century. If we look at the biggest wars, you can see the development from one to the other. You've mentioned balloons. So I'm an air defender. So I always like to tell the pilots that air defense was here first. They were using, before the Wright brothers and the birth of the airplane, they were using artillery to take down the balloons. So the Prussians used it when balloons were used in the siege on Paris in 1870. And as you mentioned, in the American Civil War. If we try to look at the first war where air power was a major impact, you can look at the First World War. It started off with recon and gathering intel and very primitive ways of throwing bombs from the airplanes, or having dogfights using pistols, or people throwing ropes, trying to get them to get stuck in the rotor of the enemy airplane.
So there were pilots on airplanes shooting at each other with pistols?
Yeah.
Wow.
Actually, the first airplane taking down another airplane is when someone was using the pistol and hitting I think it was a Frenchman, taking down a German. It's not as successful. The first big thing that happened was putting a machine gun that was synced with the rotor. So you can aim and fire your cannon on the direction you're flying to. So this was the first major development of dogfights, and the well and renowned Red Baron,
Sure.
Manfred von Richthofen, and a few other Germans and Allied forces officers, pilots that had a lot of hits. Von Richthofen had more than 80 balloons and aircraft that he took from...
He took down.
Yeah, he took down. This is all like very primitive. If you look, this is dogfighting. Okay, aircraft against aircraft.
When did strategic bombing come into the picture?
Actually, the first one was using Zeppelins. So the Germans were using that against the Brits in the First World War. It wasn't as significant and didn't create the effect if you compare it to the battle on Britain in the Second World War. But it did cause the English to Iraq to establish the RAF, the Royal Air Force. And they said, okay, there's something new going on, and we're going to organize our Air Force for strategic bombing. So it wasn't like you had a bomber the way we considered bombers, even if you look at the WW2 bombers. Okay, it was still very primitive, but it had a sort of capability of taking bigger payloads and being able to carry them on airplanes that were going not into the tactical battlefield, but to the cities, to that kind of areas. And that was, you can say, the beginning of strategic bombing.
In your article in the Dado Center Journal about air power, you're talking about the development of air power up to Vietnam. And we know that air power, because it's platform-based, is very it's technology-centric. Can you describe the role of technology in the air power development between World War II and Vietnam, basically?
Well, technology is a major factor. If you look at the air power, you know, we had the biplanes of WW1, and at the end of the Second World War, you have the first jet fighter. You had the Messerschmitt 262, the German one, which wasn't that significant because the Allied forces were able to tackle the fuel infrastructure and so on. So they didn't have enough fuel to train pilots, develop the doctrine, and so on. But that was a very big leap forward technology-wise. And you can see that after the Second World War, you have the first jet fighters. They met in MiG-Ali in Korea, 1950 to 1953. You had the MiG-15 versus the F-86, the Sabre, the American Sabre. And that one, you can say it's you have the first generation. Just for reference, nowadays, F-35 is considered the fifth generation. So that was one major fact if you look at the way fighters have developed. If you look at bombers, the bigger thing was the range and the ability to carry a big payload. If you wanted to use the atomic bomb against Japan at the end of in 1945, the only machine able to carry that and flee, not being affected by the effect of the bomb, was I think it was a B-29, an American bomber for that matter. And that success made the bomber it was the backbone of American strategic air power in that period of time. Let's say from the end of the Second World War all the way through Vietnam and so on. It was all about range and payload.
So we've talked about the historical development. We talked about World War II. The United States Air Force comes out of World War II as the big dog, the top dog. They could bomb strategically. They could beat anyone in massive dogfights. Now, you wrote about Vietnam in your article, and the performance was very different in Vietnam. So my first question is, how is it possible that this U.S. Air Force goes from World War II to Vietnam in the space of, say, 2 decades, a little less, and has lost its abilities, has lost its edge over world air forces?
Well, the Americans were the top dog. If you look at the summer of 1945, they had air superiority in Europe, in Africa, in the Pacific. They had great technology, and they had great doctrine, very innovative in the way that, for instance, the Americans in the Pacific, they were fighting the Japanese Zero fighter that had a few upsides. He was better than the fighters the Americans were using, and they found a tactical solution, doctrine. They developed a tactic to make the most of their characteristics, for that matter. So 1945, the Americans are on top. The two main reasons that caused them to neglect the area of dogfighting or ACMs, which is like maneuverable airfights, was first at the beginning of the Cold War. So the world power, you had like the West versus the East, and the bomber, or the strategic bomber, or to be precise, the nuclear-capable strategic bomber was the thing that dominated the sphere. So it was having the nuclear weapon and the bomber for itself. So they said, okay, conventional weapons or conventional warfare, it's not going to be the thing. It's the thing of the past. It's irrelevant. We don't need to train that much, to have the force buildup, to use the state-of-the-art technology for brand new fighters. And you can see that in a few aspects. First of all, you can see that the Americans, once the Soviets had nuclear capabilities, they had a successful test in 1949. They transmitted it or transferred it to military capability, meaning having a nuclear bomb and an intercontinental bomber that can carry it to attack American cities, let's say in the beginning of the 50s. So the Americans said, okay, I'm going to use my interceptors, my fighters, to intercept that kind of aircrafts.
And what kind of aircrafts were these?
So we're talking second generation of fighters, Century series for that matter. And if you want to look at that kind of concept, the F-104, called the missile with the man in it, is the best example for that.
So very fast, not very maneuverable.
Very fast, very short wings, not that maneuverable. So you can't be in a dogfight maneuvering against another fighter. You can be fast enough if you're chasing a bomber, which is, not maneuvering at all and is a big target. That was the example for that. So you couldn't really use the F-104 for dogfighting. So all the air defense capability for jets was against the Soviet bombers. And the other thing is that the Americans didn't think they need escorts or fighter escorts for their bombers. So they said, okay, the bomber would get through. We're going to have a lot of forces going to Europe. We're going to drop our bombs. And the Soviets won't be able to stop us, so we don't need any fighters to escort us.
Anyway, so after that, in the 60s, the U.S. is getting the war. Never thought it's going to fight the Vietnam War. And
actually, they had a wake-up call in the beginning of the 50s. They had the Korean War. And the interesting thing is that, the saber, the star of the Korean War, he was an outcome of the AAR of WW2. So he was already in production, and he was originally intended to use for Air Defense Command back in the US. So they were able to deploy him to Korea. And you say, okay, this was a conventional war. They were doing close air support, dogfights, all of that. And this is in an era that the Cold War, it's a fact. But it was not the wake-up call you might have thought it would.
So they get to Vietnam and...
Yeah, and before that, President Eisenhower just got into office. He got a ceasefire, and he actually said with his doctrine, like massive retaliation, never again, we're not gonna get the U.S. mixed in that like a low-intensity conflict anywhere in the world. We're gonna keep it strategic, nuclear, against the Soviets.
So the Vietnam War happens, and what happens with the Air Force? Do they say, okay, we have the capabilities we need anyway? Do they understand the problem and have to go to war anyway? What is the process once they understand that war that they thought was never going to happen comes to pass?
One more thing that happened technology-wise is getting the first air-to-air missiles. So they were designed to take down bombers.
Is that the Sidewinder?
Yeah, Sidewinder, Sparrow, and the Falcon. Some of them were developed by the Navy, some of them by the Air Force. For instance, the F-4, the Phantom, the original version had no cannon. So I said, okay, we only need missiles. So once you need to intercept small maneuvering aircraft like MiG-19, MiG-21s, you can do that with the missiles. You're having problem locking on the aircraft. The fuse is not good enough. It's a different kind of target. So the missiles don't work, but you don't have the cannon for backup. You have dogfights in a very close range. The only thing that could help you is the cannon, but you don't have it, and you actually you lose airplanes because the MiG do have this cannon. They improvised like an external cannon, which wasn't good enough. It was the accuracy level was low, and only in like later versions they had like the built-in cannon within the Phantom. So it was a manifestation of the concept saying, okay, technology is here, we need only missiles.
sounds very familiar with a more current version of this.
Yeah, and that's a big dilemma. You know that something is there's something new technology-wise, but it's a very big question. When do you put your money on it? When it's good enough? When do you leave the previous technology behind and let go? And it happened to the Americans in the 60s regarding the missiles and the cannons for the fighters, but it happens all the time for militaries around the world.
So let's talk about how the Vietnam War, how the Air Force, the American Air Force, actually fought during the Vietnam War. How did they perform?
Well, first of all, the currency level was very low for the personnel because they didn't really train on that. They didn't train a lot of dogfighting. The fighters trained on taking down the bombers or having nuclear strikes.
Nuclear tactical strikes.
Yeah, nuclear tactical strikes.
So all of a sudden, even fighters were doing nuclear stuff.
Yeah, of course, because that was the buzzword. So Tactical Air Command wanted a piece of the action, the budgets. Even in the beginning of the 50s, they went into nuclear tactical strikes. Actually, the Americans, they had the Phantom, the F-4, which was a third-generation aircraft, because he was one of the first multi-roles.
Which so can do both.
Yeah, both or multiple. He can do the close air support and the air defense. He was something new. In the Vietnam War, you can see there's a big difference between Air Force and Navy reaction to the low success rates that they had in the dogfights. So after the first period of war, from 65 to 68, the Navy and the Air Force got to very different conclusions. Air Force said, okay, we have a problem. We're not good enough. We need to deal with the technology. Okay, so we have the internal gun for the Phantom, and we had some tweaks on the missiles. Navy said, okay, our problem is not the missiles, it's not the technology, it's the personnel. We need to train differently. You can see the different concept. Air Force not willing to they didn't have a navigator. They put like a co-pilot in the backseat of the Phantoms. While the Navy said, okay, we're going to have a RIO, radar interception officer, someone which is specializing in using the radars to use the missiles, taking down the enemy airplanes. So it took a while for the Air Force to do that. The Navy said, okay, we're going to establish Top Gun. We're going to have a special school training our guys how to do dogfights. And it didn't happen for the Air Force only after the war. Like 73, 74, they started the first red flag exercises and aggressor squadrons in the Air Force. So you can see that in the second period of fighting, 72, 73, the Navy had an improved kill ratio, moving from 1 to 2 to 1 to 10 or 12, while the Air Force stayed in the same kill ratio of 1.1 to 2, 1 to 3.
So what you have here in Vietnam is basically two services from the same armed forces getting from the same conflict to completely different outcomes, lessons learned. One of them is technological, and one of them is training personnel.
Yeah, doctrinal.
And the technological, as opposed to what we might think, is not the optimal solution.
It's crucial. It's very important. But sometimes, I think it's more popular nowadays, is depending on technology and neglecting the other parts of force buildup. And I think that talking about knowledge and the doctrine is one of the main issues. And it has a lot with technology. I'll give an example. When you have a new weapon system, you have like lessons learned. So you have like upgrades to the software and to the user interface and so on and so on. It means that the guys operating that system has to focus on learning the new features like every 6 months, every year or so. You don't have enough time to play with the weapon system and saying, okay, this is the best way for me to use it. So we have like an initial idea of how we use it. I think in a lot of cases, we are focused on getting the new features, like assimilated, and not really think about the concept on the way we use our technology. Like a famous example is the machine guns in the First World War. And the way the Germans used it and the French used it, and it was the same machine gun, but the way you put two machine guns together to make a 100% kill ratio did all the difference. So you had the same technology, but doctrine made a difference.
And of course, then war comes and changes everything. And these days, you can hear a lot about defense policymakers talking about how to implement technology faster. But what you're saying is that technology, even assuming we can develop technology like Google does or Amazon does, we need time to think how it works in the military. So it's another factor that limits the speed of implementation of technology.
First of all, it's a big challenge, and I want that new software update. I do want it, but it's easier for us to manage software versions than making sure that we're using the equipment the best way. We need training for that. We need to have experiments that are focused on doctrine, not on, okay, the manufacturer said it's going to be good for range of 200 meters. Yes, I've checked it, and it is. It's about the way I'm using that kind of weapons. I think nowadays, if you look at the organizational aspect, the way that militaries are structured, we have a lot of emphasis on the requirement department and all the guys that are purchasing all the new toys. But we don't have enough personnel dealing with developing the doctrine and making sure that the big concept is feasible and it's relevant for the operational scenario.
The way you structure it in the article in the Dado Center Journal is the technology and concept. And as you say there, militaries today invest ridiculous amount of resources in technology, but not a lot in concept. How much, for instance, do you think a Western military invests in concept development?
I think the thing is that you put so much money into purchasing and developing that if you want to have a good ROI, you need to have it developed around a concept, around a doctrine. Because the way the military industrial complex is, it's very difficult for military leadership to say no to all these new gadgets coming in. If you don't have a concept, you can't really say, okay, I don't really need that. That's a nice proposal, but I don't need it. I have the capabilities I need, and you're not giving me this big improvement I'm looking for. Or for instance, you can focus the industry on the military needs, saying, I have a concept. I have 4 layers. I have a very good equipment for layer number 1, number 2, and number 4. But I need to fill in the level 3. So you can be not just reactive to what the guys at the industry are trying to sell, but you can tell them, okay, guys, go develop that.
Now, if you were chief of staff, you had, if you were king of the world, and could structure the system differently, what would you do?
You need to have a bigger trade doc. You need to have guys. I think it's a lot of a cultural thing. So I'll give an example from the Air Force. You need the guys in the operational squadrons to be aware of the tools, the capabilities, to have the culture and the mindset of innovating, not just by saying, I need that switch bigger, larger, in a different color, but talking about doctrine and about the way that you can make a big difference if you just use your weapons in a different way. So it starts with culture and not going automatically to the technological solution. Second of all, it's about being able to have, like, I'll call it labs or places for experiments that are about doctrine. It's about different concept of employing the technology that we have, and maybe take the new gadget, see if it helps before we commit to purchasing it.
Something like prototype fielding.
Let's take one piece of it and test it in the ecosystem. I think that might prove itself useful.
There's also the thing of, in the American military, there are a lot of reading lists. Reading is important. Do you think it will work here in the Israeli Air Force if you force, tell them?
I think it all goes back to culture. The other day I've seen this slogan saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So you can have all the right TTPs and all the white papers and the doctrine papers and senior leadership saying that. But at the end of the day, what counts is what the soldier on the ground is doing and the junior pilot. So we need to cultivate a culture that is about knowledge. I think the IAF and the IDF have a very strong culture of innovation, thinking of outside the box, not restraining yourself too much to rules and regulations. Our challenge is to maintain that culture, not becoming a band of like bandits, but making places or, making the ecosystem in some places inside the system for those bandits. So we're not too bureaucratic. We're not following the rules and regulations too much and losing this feel of I can do it better. Or maybe, just raising doubts.
Yeah, it's reading the regulations but knowing that when not.
Yeah, and being, have the culture saying, okay, Colonel, I might be like in 03, but I think that we need to change that. I've tried that. I think we can do it better. And I think we need to give the colonel or the GO the option and the tool to say, okay, let's test it. I don't think that even, if a general gets that kind of statement, I don't think that he possesses the tools to verify or the other way around to check that assumption that the junior officer said. We've neglected that. We don't have not the organization and not the tools.
So we rely on industry to push technology, which we can't validate.
Yeah,
and
sometimes we embrace new concepts because if you look at the slideshow, it makes sense.
It always looks nice.
It makes sense, and it looks very elegant and relevant, and it really looks like an answer to a big problem. But we need to put a big emphasis on validating. We know what we have to do. If you need to have a big exercise with a special red team that is mimicking the enemy, we should do that. We have that on tactical level just to get the pilot, the single pilot trained on how it's going to look like when you meet like an enemy fighter jet. But as a system, we still have a lot of improvement to make.
So one final question: if you have to recommend, somebody read your article and wants to maybe learn more about that technology and concept and this whole story of the Air Force and Vietnam and a bit afterwards and before, what would you recommend reading?
Well, first of all, the United States Air Force has a superb Department of History.
Yeah, which is
so
important.
Everything is documented. I think the Israeli Air Force for sure, and I think even in the IDF level we have some room for improvement on that. There's a lot of the documented history of that. US Air Force History Department. There's a great book that I love called Setup by Earl Tilford, which talks about how the American forces, the Air Force, built itself toward Vietnam and what happened during Vietnam and the lessons learned. I think it's a great book, and there's a lot of info online.
You just have to look.
I've seen, you have to find the right groups on Facebook, and you've got this comment from this veteran, and he was flying F-4s in Vietnam. He's giving you like a new, outlook on stuff. I think that that's one of the reasons that I've decided on focusing on American US Air Force, because there's a lot of information, a lot of great reading you can find.
Αν σας άρεσε το βίντεο, πατήστε like και εγγραφή στο κανάλι. Για να λαμβάνετε πρώτοι τις ειδοποιήσεις για νέα βίντεο, πατήστε και το καμπανάκι. Σας ευχαριστούμε θερμώς για την υποστήριξη.